Let's bring in my first guest, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Patricia.
You tweeted last week, which piqued my interest. It was after the debate between, of course, the two men that want to be Prime Minister, that governments always model negative gearing. If you take the policy and its merits, do you believe it is something that could have a positive effect to be modelled and looked at again by any future government?
Well, it's always being modelled because it's a big tax concession. So you've got to know how much it's costing you in revenue. And so that's really the point I made. You know, journalists were calling me, and I thought it was easier just to state the facts in that tweet. And indeed, there's quite a bit of detail about this, our consideration of negative gearing during my government in my memoir. So, you know, this is just public knowledge. Look, I think you've got to look at everything, Patricia. I think most of the potential changes to the tax system are well understood, and really it's important that governments keep an open mind. But, you know, both sides have ruled out any changes to negative gearing, as I understand it. And so it's not going to be a matter in the next parliament, or so it would appear. The big question, the big issue during my time on negative gearing was there were some colleagues, Scott Morrison in particular, Michael Sukar as another, who were very strongly of the view that we should make big changes to negative gearing because they thought it would be seen to have a beneficial impact on housing affordability. Our conclusion as a government was that while repealing negative gearing would certainly improve government revenues, so the Treasury would be happy, we didn't believe it would have anything other than a very short-term effect, and even then a negligible one, on housing affordability.
How about capital gains tax concessions?
Well, that's not touching that is not just a third rail, that is a kryptonite third rail. So, you know, yeah, sure. I mean, you could, you know, people say because the home, you know, a homeowner's residence is capital gains tax free. That encourages people to put more money, more capital into housing. But, you know, nobody in their right political mind would ever countenance making changes to that.
I want to talk about a couple of other issues, if we can, this afternoon. In Queensland, the Coalition has put One Nation second in 18 of the state's 30 seats. It seems to me like a huge departure from what has been a decades-long, steering away from putting One Nation high up. Of course, John Howard famously made that an edict. I think it was in 2001, we recall. Are you surprised about the shift on this?
Not really. You know, the LNP, which is, you know, the combination of the Liberal and National parties in Queensland, have always been very concerned about losing votes to their right. You know, to One Nation, to Qatar, to Palmer, for example. And so, you know, that's a signal really to, it's a peace offering, if you like, to One Nation. And, you know, hoping that One Nation will respond with preferencing them, number two, as well. So it's just practical politics. Politics is all about numbers, and this is just pragmatism.
The big dispute that still is kind of going on in this political campaign is in relation to Russia and whether it wants a base or wants something in Indonesia. The government says Indonesia has ruled it out, but the Coalition has consistently been arguing that more questions have to be answered on that. Do you think there's a reason to be concerned about what's going on here, and there should be a briefing provided to the opposition that it is a really important issue that needs to be resolved in this campaign?
Well, look, it's not normal to do briefings of this kind during caretaker. So that's the first point. You know, because during caretaker, the government's not able to make any new policy decisions. If they were planning to, or if they were thinking of doing so, then they would normally have to bring in the shadow minister and say, OK, you know, we're considering making this decision. We want you to be aligned with it. But, you know, what are we, less than 2 weeks out from polling day? So no one's going to be making any big changes. So it's not normal to give a briefing. I can see why the opposition wants to talk the issue up politically, but I'm not sure what the story is. I mean, the Indonesians have made it clear that they are not going to provide a base to the Russians. That doesn't mean they won't provide them a base in the future, but Indonesia's a sovereign country. I mean, that's really up to them, and I suppose up to us to, and our friends and allies to persuade the Indonesians it's not in their interest or the interests of ASEAN to have a Russian military base in Indonesia. And look, to be honest, while Indonesia's had a history of buying arms from Russia and the Soviet Union in the past, and it is a non-aligned country that it tries to not take sides, I would be astonished if the Indonesians decide let me put it this way, it would be a big change if the Indonesians were to agree to any one of the superpowers, so-called, to be having a military base on their territory. It'd be really counter to, their non-aligned status to do that.
And the Indonesians well from your time as Prime Minister. Having this debate in our political campaign, is it really the best way to deal with the Indonesians and have the impact we want to have, which is, of course, to avoid any potential Russian base or Russian presence there?
Well, I think it's important dealing with Indonesia to be respectful and to have open lines of communication. I mean, I had a very good relationship with President Joko Widodo, and we had very strong relations. It's from what I can see, the Labor government with Penny Wong as Foreign Minister have done a good job in really improving relations with Indonesia. They did, they did suffer under the Morrison government. There was a lot of umbrage taken by the announcement, you may remember, to move Australia's embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and that wasn't canvassed or communicated to Indonesia beforehand. It is our neighbour. It is the world's largest Muslim country. It was not a sensitive move, put it this way, in regional context. But look, I think relations are good. Argy-bargy in politics. Look, the Indonesians have pretty robust political contests too. I think each of us should cut the other plenty of slack in terms of argy-bargy in political campaigns. But normally you would expect both sides of politics to be fairly measured on matters of foreign policy like this. I mean, I think we've had a statement from the Indonesian government that they're not going to have any Russian base on their territory. I think that's basically where you should leave it in public terms. Of course, the government today, but particularly after the election, when we have a new government with all the legitimacy of an election, has got to continue engaging with Indonesia and continuing to develop our close relationship with them. And our argument is really that we should have a region that is free of great power rivalry, if we, as far as we can manage that. I mean, obviously, it's not entirely within our control.
I don't want to prosecute the election of 2016 again, but you were pretty grumpy about Mediscare. Grumpy's a polite word.
I was extremely grumpy.
I know.
Yes.
So let's not go through all of your grumpiness again, but I will ask this.
I've de-grumped.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Very kind of you, kind sir. But on Mediscare, Peter Dutton thinks that's going on again in this election campaign. That's what Labor's doing. Is that right?
Well, I don't think it's as blatant as what happened in 2016. I mean, it was that was a pretty audacious lie. So, but let's not get into that. I mean, the problem that Dutton faces is that he does have form. You see, the difficulty that Peter has, and Peter should have inoculated this a long way in advance. I mean, Abbott got elected in 2013. He said no cuts to health. Okay, that was a promise. He gets in, and there was a proposal, as you recall, for there to be a co-payment in addition, in other words, to see the doctor, so that the Medicare, you wouldn't be able to see the doctor for free. There would be an additional payment required. Now that was a very big change. Dutton was the health minister. He has to wear that track record, and if I were him, I would have inoculated against that very comprehensively long before this campaign, because this you want to call it a scare, call it a scare. This was going to come up. This was inevitable. This was coming like Christmas. So you should have anticipated it.
You've previously called Peter Dutton a thug. Do you still stand by that?
I'm not going to repeat it, but I've expressed views about Peter as he has expressed about me. So I don't think either of us would qualify those opinions. But I'm not going to repeat them.
Why do you think the coalition is struggling, if you at least believe the published opinion polls?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. I think Dutton is an issue. His personality, his perception of being close to Trump or Trump-like is clearly an issue. I was very struck with how big a factor the nuclear policy of the coalition has become. I saw one poll today which showed that was the largest turnoff of voters. And to be honest with you, I'm not surprised. It's a really bad idea. I mean, it was never had any legs economically or as in legitimate policy terms. I mean, it is a fact that no private sector energy company would contemplate undertaking nuclear generation. It doesn't make sense for Australia. Our future is renewables, wind and solar backed by batteries and hydro. That's obvious. That's our competitive advantage, and we're lucky. We've got that as our advantage. Let's make use of it. So nuclear was really designed as a wedge issue. It played well in the right-wing media. It was a way to say we're not going to do. It was a way for Peter to say to his base, "You don't like renewables, well, neither do I. What about nuclear? Then we won't have to build transmission lines and so forth."
Well, he argued in the debate, for instance, and then the follow-up when he was questioned about his climate change credentials. He made the point that if people believed in, getting to net zero, they should vote for his policies because his will credibly get you to net zero, and that he does believe in climate change. Do you think that's a persuasive case for belief in climate change?
Look, the nuclear, Patricia, believe me, the nuclear proposition was always a bad policy idea. Okay, it takes far too long, it costs far too much, and it is continuous generation. Nuclear power stations run 24 hours a day. Our big comparative advantage in Australia is solar and wind, but particularly solar. It's so cheap and getting cheaper. So what we need to do is invest in the firming technologies of storage, batteries, pumped hydro generally. As you know, Lucy and I are developing pumped hydro projects. I have an interest in the industry. But that's the way you firm your renewable advantage and you get 24/7 power. But so it was always a bad idea. To be honest, I don't think many people in the coalition genuinely believed it was a good idea. On policy terms, I think they thought it was smart politically, and it has blown up in their face politically, and that's partly because it was bad policy. I mean, Keating used to say good policy is good politics. Well, bad policy is bad politics too, so I'm not surprised they've been caught out by this.
Malcolm Turnbull, it was great to speak to you. Thank you.
Great to talk to you too.
Well, this big issue around whether there should be a briefing given to the opposition has been very much in the headlines today. I want to bring in my next guest, the Shadow Foreign Minister, David Coleman. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon, Patricia.
Now, just to be clear, we asked the government to put a minister to appear opposite you, of course, and they were unable to provide anyone this afternoon. So it's just me and you. So let's try and enjoy ourselves thoroughly. I'm sure we will, David Coleman.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your time. Anthony Albanese has derided the opposition this morning for asking for an Indonesia briefing, saying he was waiting for you to ask for a briefing on who faked the moon landing. Obviously, he's trying to make an exaggerated point there. Why is there an obligation on the government to provide this briefing? Because just a moment ago, Malcolm Turnbull said there isn't an obligation under the conventions.
Well, Patricia, what Anthony Albanese is trying to do is it's sort of that, magician that sort of says, look over there, don't look at me. This is a really serious matter. the prospect of Russian military expansion in our region is chilling. And if Russia has sought access to a military base on a permanent basis in Indonesia, that is a very significant issue for our national security. Now, what we've heard from the government is mainly nothing on this point, except for yesterday when Murray Watt said there is no proposal from Russia to have a base anywhere in Indonesia. Now, nobody from the government is backing that up today, including Murray Watt. So all we're getting from the government is evasion. And it is really important, Patricia, because we are in an election campaign, and obviously should the coalition be successful, understanding the status of this issue, these Russian apparent overtures to Indonesia, is really important.
But if Indonesia has rejected the plan, what are you going to achieve in the next 2 weeks? It's rejected. If you're trying to find out what may have happened in terms of a deliberation which has been rejected, what do you achieve by pushing for this?
Well, Patricia, I think plainly understanding Russia's activities in the region, the overtures that it appears to have been made are very important. And indeed, so is how has our government responded. So first question, did the government know about it? If they did, what did they do? If they didn't know about this overture, if it occurred, why didn't they know? Now, these are the questions the government doesn't want to answer. And that's why you've had 6 days now of the Prime Minister ducking and weaving all over the place. Senior journalists following up this issue, just asking for a simple answer. He won't give it, and he's throwing the switch to vaudeville and coming up with outlandish, silly comments so that people report the outlandish, silly comments rather than the substance here. The substance here is that the report is that Russia sought an aircraft base within about 1,300 kilometres of Darwin. That is a very significant issue, and of course they should brief on it. And, was Murray Watt's announcement yesterday that there was no Russian proposal, was that correct? Or was it wrong?
Well, actually, the full quote on Sky, because it's been selectively quoted, is there is no proposal from Russia to have a base anywhere in Indonesia in the way that Peter Dutton and his colleagues have been claiming over the last couple of weeks. That's the quote. It's not just that there's no proposal, just because it is a different quote then, isn't it?
Oh, I think that's an interesting characterisation, Patricia. He's saying there is no proposal for Russia to have a base anywhere in Indonesia. I'm just quoting the whole quote. That's all I'm doing. Sure. But I think on the plain meaning, he's saying there is no proposal from Russia to have a base anywhere in Indonesia. Now, if that's right, then the government should say so. If it's not right, they should say so. And of course, if the briefing is provided, any confidentiality will of course be respected, but it's appropriate to provide it. Now, we provided briefings to the government, to the now government back during the 2022 election campaign in relation to some foreign affairs
But this issues. Is different, right? I mean, even Malcolm Turnbull, he was the Prime Minister of your own side of politics, says that if Indonesia has ruled it out, that having this played out publicly is not at all helpful.
Well, it's clearly incumbent upon the government to provide a briefing on such a significant issue of national security. And as I said, if there's confidential material that's part of that briefing, we will respect that. But the issue is, Patricia, I mean, who knows what the government knew about this, if anything at all? And I would think, from your experience as a journalist, if a Prime Minister will not answer a question for 6 days in a row, it's usually not a good sign. And that's where we're at on this issue. So the Prime Minister can clear it up by providing a briefing. He can certainly clarify whether Senator Watt's comments were correct or not. I mean, Senator Watt made those comments publicly. So is it correct? Is there no proposal from Russia for an airbase anywhere in Indonesia? And the government, instead of slipping and sliding and dodging and weaving and frankly just looking shifty, the PM can just step up and, he's supposed to be the leader of this country and he needs to show some maturity on this issue.
You want him to provide you this briefing, but Malcolm Turnbull says it's not normal to provide this briefing. Do you accept that it's not normal to provide the briefing?
No, I don't actually. And there were, as I said, there were briefings provided during the last election campaign. There was one in relation to a vessel off our coast that was provided to Brendan O'Connor after he requested it. And look, you know, the government can sort of put up any sort of bureaucratic argument, which interestingly, Patricia, they're doing on background rather than anyone actually owning up to it. But leave that to one side. I mean, the government can put up any sort of technical argument they want, but plainly, it is reasonable for the opposition to be briefed on this issue. Plainly, they don't want to do it. Now, why don't they want to do it? Because they've obviously got something to hide.
Well, they argue, just to put their perspective, and you're right, they should come on, but they argue that there is no proposal because Indonesia said no, and that ends the issue. That's what they say. So there is nothing to be briefed about because there's nothing happening.
Oppositions are frequently briefed on issues in similar circumstances, and the notion that there must be some pending agreement is not correct. So look, and again, it's clearly within their remit to provide the briefing, but the bottom line is they don't want to do it, right? They don't want to do it. I think we can all agree on that, Patricia.
Yeah, I think we can.
Yeah, and so why don't they want to do it? I think that is the question, and I think one of the reasons could be because the briefing would be embarrassing for them, because perhaps they weren't aware of this issue, perhaps they were aware of it but took inadequate action. But either way, you don't need to be a PhD in international relations to see that this is a serious issue and the government wants to do anything except talk about it, and that is not a good sign about the conduct of foreign affairs by this government.
I spoke to Tim Costello. We're going to play that interview shortly. And he says churches have written to the Liberals, to your side of politics, asking that there are no cuts to foreign aid. Is that something you'll guarantee?
Well, look, we'll have more to say about foreign aid in the days ahead, Patricia. It's a very important part of our foreign affairs policy. We spend about $5 billion a year on foreign aid, so it's quite a substantial amount of expenditure, and it's particularly crucial in our own region, in the Pacific, and that's why we so significantly increased foreign aid to the Pacific, so that by the time of our last budget prior to the 22 election, the funding to the Pacific was significantly more than when we'd been elected, provided for in that budget. So it is an important issue, and the points of those church leaders are well made. We'll have more to say on that in the future. It's obviously very conscious.
Okay, do you see a nexus? Let me ask this, sorry to interrupt, but
sure.
A nexus between increasing defence spending, which you are clearly planning to do this week. We don't know any of the details. I know you're not going to tell me the exact amount, but increasing defence spending and needing to find a saving in perhaps foreign aid, are they linked to you?
Look, what I would say, Patricia, is that foreign aid, particularly in our region, has obviously a really important humanitarian function, but also an important strategic one. And, we have seen under this agreement, government rather, the CCP sign a comprehensive strategic partnership with the Cook Islands, policing agreements with Kiribati and Vanuatu. And that's just a reminder of why foreign aid in the Pacific is important. It's part of its function in helping to build those relationships. And so it's certainly something that we're conscious of, and that's why we provided significantly for foreign aid in the Pacific when we're in government.
Just finally, obviously today has been a big focus on crime for the Coalition, with a couple of announcements, $750 million. Peter Dutton said in February of a sex offender register that, and I quote, "We tried to push it when we were in government. The states largely weren't interested." So he's made this announcement again today. What's changed? Why would the states suddenly be interested?
Well, this is a somewhat different proposal, Patricia. This is what's called a disclosure scheme. So rather than a publicly available register, what this is about is if a parent is concerned about perhaps someone who is involved with their kids in some way or in contact with their kids, they can go to the police and seek information about that person. And if that person does have any relevant convictions. It's up to the police to determine whether or not that information should be provided. So it's different to a widely available register. It's in place in the WA, it's in place in the UK. And I think if we just take a step back here, Patricia, and we say, as a parent, would it be a good thing if you had concerns about someone who was perhaps working with your child and you wanted to see if you could get information from the police about any conviction that person might have? Would that be a good thing if you could do that? Absolutely. And that's what this is about. We think it's common sense. It's very consistent, to be frank, with Peter Dutton's career over many decades of seeking to protect children and really lean forward on these issues. Now, Murray Watt very oddly described this as a cynical move this morning. There's nothing cynical about protecting children from predators. And WA is doing it, the UK is doing it, and we want to trial it at the federal level too.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia.
Continuing on the Coalition's crime announcement from earlier today, the Prime Minister rejected the policy this morning, saying they already have committed to action on these areas.
There's a national child offender system in place right now. My government will respond positively to any request from police or security agencies, as we have done. My government is the first government to set up a national firearms register.
Let's get some analysis on the start of the second last week of the election campaign. Digital correspondent, friend of the program, and to me, Jacob Grieber. Hello.
G'day, g'day.
Okay, does it work for the Coalition to pivot to crime? I mean, there was a question, for instance, which I thought was really very pointed today to Peter Dutton, saying, why didn't you become the AFP Commissioner or a state
or
Premier?
A Premier.
Yeah, like, you know, because these are state issues. They're not really national issues very often.
He's trying to make the point that these are matters that he's not only cares about, but has a long history of worrying about, whether he was Home Affairs Minister or indeed when he was working for the police force. So he's trying to remind voters that this is an area which he considers to be one of his strengths. And so talking about this register that he's proposed helps to do that. The other point being as well, crime does show up in the list of concerns that people have, things that are bothering them. That list for the last year or two or three actually has really been dominated by cost of living. But when you go down the list, crime does appear, and we saw, Patricia, in the Queensland state election, the Coalition, or the LNP in that case, made a lot of ground talking about what it was going to do about how to address crime. It was one of the reasons Labor really got hit all the way up and down the coast, and we saw a similar thing in the Northern Territory. So I think Peter Dutton's hoping that he can pull off a similar kind of shift away from the government by talking about these issues.
The other big issue is still, and I'm kind of surprised about this, Jacob. I didn't know that this issue around Indonesia and Russia would go into this week again. The opposition has been calling for a briefing on what the government knew. The government doesn't want to give them this briefing. I had Malcolm Turnbull on a little earlier. Now, he's well known as not being a great fan of Peter Dutton's, even though, you know, of course, they were in the same government together. But just, you know, that's well known, but just to make it clear. But he also says that a briefing like this would be unusual. It's not standard or normal. Is that right?
Yeah, I was going to make some flippant comment about how Albanese should probably take the rest of the week off and let Malcolm run the campaign, because everything in that interview was a takedown of Peter Dutton, whether on the nuclear position and on this Indonesia position in particular. But it's interesting, the point about should there be a briefing given or not. Mike Pizzullo, who's a former head of government departments and has worked for both sides, tells me that that there is no case for such a briefing under the caretaker conventions, because there's no urgent policy decision, Patricia. And Malcolm Turnbull made a very similar point, but he does suggest that it might be good practice to do it. But he also recommends if the government were to provide access to a briefing, it would be on the condition that they wouldn't talk about what was in the briefing. So the opposition might be, might need to be careful what it wishes for here. But at this stage, PK, it really doesn't look like there's any sign of that happening.
It seems to me, Jacob, as a seasoned observer here, that this is the coalition's way of keeping these issues of national security on the agenda, that they still think that it's a net positive for them. This crime, the government doesn't want those issues on the agenda, which is why I presume they're not really, out only answering questions on this, but not on the front foot on this. Is that what's going on here? And is the coalition right to be making crime at the last minute the biggest issue that voters remember before they go to potentially vote tomorrow, given cost of living is the number one issue for people?
Look, I think it's probably mixed on that question. I think the government is not uncomfortable about this discussion about Indonesia and Russia. There is a bit of mopping up to do. That quote from Murray Watt, and you read it out in its entirety, is a little different to just quoting the front half, but it's muddied the water sufficiently for the opposition to see an opening. But frankly, Labor is not uncomfortable talking in this space either, because it can simply remind people that Peter Dutton was much more declarative last week when he said the Indonesian president had asserted that Russia was making this request for military basing there. So it's one of those issues I suspect that cuts both ways, Patricia. And on the law and order push, don't underestimate how potent that is in some electorates, in some parts of the country where people are worried about these issues.
Oh, yeah, look, there are a couple of electorates I know about, for instance, in the electorate of Bruce in Melbourne, huge issue coming up very strongly. So obviously he's talking to a concern that's going on in the community. Now, Jacob, you and I have made a podcast already today. It's called Politics Now. If people want to hear more of this, they should listen to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia.
The Nine newspapers reported this morning that Anthony Albanese made a captain's call to override Communications Minister Michelle Rowland and ditch harsher rules on gambling advertisements until after the election. Now, the Prime Minister was asked about whether there would be more action on gambling reform this term, and he defended his government's record on the issue.
My government has done more to tackle problem gambling than any government since Federation, full stop. There's more to do. I've said that, and we will do more.
What's happening in the future, though? What's happening?
Well, I just said that.
What?
Well, I just responded to your question, which was there's more to do. We'll work those issues through.
For more on this, I spoke to gambling reform advocate Tim Costello a short time ago. Tim, welcome to Afternoon Briefing.
Great to be with you.
Anthony Albanese was asked many questions today about gambling policies, and he said his government has done more to tackle problem gambling than any other government since Federation. Do you see it that way?
No, I say with great regret that's just not true. Look, what he has implemented was started by the coalition. BetStop, which is the national self-exclusion, started under the coalition. Credit betting, particularly led by a coalition member, Andrew Wallace, who chaired that committee to bring it in. And the change to the taglines about from gamble responsibly to, think what you're gambling with, started with the coalition. Now, he can certainly say he didn't stop it and he continued with bipartisan support to implement it, but he can't claim they were his initiatives.
So give me a sense as we now go. Tomorrow, people will be voting if they choose to take that early voting option. As they stand, the policies that Labor's put forward versus the coalition's, how do they differ? Are they about the same, that they believe in a limit on some gambling advertising but not a ban?
No, they're not actually. Sadly, neither Mr Dutton or the Prime Minister have responded to the Murphy report recommending a gambling ad ban. But to Mr Dutton's credit, two budget reply speeches ago, 2 years ago, before the Murphy report, he said he would ban ads an hour before, during a game and an hour after a game. The Prime Minister hasn't even matched that. And last week, the Prime Minister doubled down and said, well, next term, he's certainly not going to be banning gambling ads. So, unfortunately, the Prime Minister is behind even Mr Dutton on this.
That's obviously of great frustration to you as you've pushed for a full ban, but at this stage, neither of the major parties are anywhere near that position.
Neither are even anywhere near it, and it's a complete shock to me that when 80% of the public want the gambling ad bans, which was a multi-partisan recommendation, Labor, Libs, Nationals, Teals, Greens of the Murphy inquiry, neither has responded. And when you go, well, surely if 80% of the public want it, the leaders would follow. Not when the vested interests say no. The AFL, NRL, the sports betting companies and the broadcasters, 7, 9, 10 and Foxtel. It's very frustrating to me. It's very frustrating really for democracy.
What does it say then about the power of, as you framed it, these broadcasters, if neither side feels like they can go anywhere near a full ban, and as you say, Labor not telling us what they want to do?
Well, the power of the broadcasters, particularly in an election year, we know is extraordinary. The power of the AFL and NRL is extraordinary. We know that Reuters actually said there was $280,000 of free tickets to both sides, Liberal and Labor, for games since the Murphy report last year. $28,000 worth for the Prime Minister, $21,000 worth of tickets for the Leader of the Opposition. And it's not just the freebies, it's that then during a game in a box with a sports betting company, those people are in the Prime Minister and Mr Dutton's ear. They have access, I don't, that 80% of the public who want a gambling ad ban do not have. That's the frustration to democracy.
So in the next parliament, we don't know what kind of parliament will be formed, but is a minority government the best chance you have in getting some of the reforms you've been pushing for up and running?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. The Teals are united to ban the gambling ads, to just implement the Murphy report. Likewise, Senator David Pocock and Senator Jackie Lambie, likewise the Greens. So if I was being realistic, I would say only a minority government will see the Murphy report implementation of a ban on gambling ads, and for that matter, the other recommendations to move health from racing and sport where it sits to move gambling from racing and sport where it sits into the health departments. At the moment, not one state health department or a federal health department has anyone working on gambling. No one assigned to it. It's in racing and sport. Another recommendation of Murphy was the national regulator instead of the 6 people in the Northern Territory Racing and Wagering Commission regulating all the online bookies, 3 of whom have gambling interests. It's a farce. We need a national regulator. Only a minority government, I suspect, will see these things happen.
Look, I want to change the topic to another thing I know you're very passionate about. Later this week, it seems, we will get the Coalition's defence policy. We know they would like to increase defence spending. We don't know by how much or how they will pay for that. In the United Kingdom, where defence spending has also been increased, there was also a cut to foreign aid. We don't know what the Coalition will do on that question. What is your view on the foreign aid budget?
I think it's incredibly important. We know that with USAID cutting over 40 billion out, not only it's a humanitarian disaster, but the US has now lost all soft power. And it's China, which has an aid program, very generous, moving into the Pacific, moving in elsewhere. Look, we have had all the heads of churches write to Mr Dutton and say, do not rob foreign aid to increase defence. We have had lots of churches right across the board, from the left to the right of the church, absolutely united, saying to Mr Dutton and the Prime Minister, do not cut aid. Now, in the last budget, Labor increased aid by $130 million, and we were relieved. I really hope the costings that they bring out, Mr Dutton brings out, that does not see a cut to aid.
Tim Costello, always great to speak to you. Thanks for coming on.
That's a pleasure.
As As journalists, including, of course, us on this program, we run around the country in the last 2 weeks of the campaign trying to understand what the biggest issues are, particularly in marginal seats, the seats that swing the election, and trying to determine how various cost of living measures are being received in the community. Sometimes there might be one issue in an electorate that might be being ignored overall, and it seems that one of the big sleeper issues of this election campaign is gender. Now, we've known for a while that men are moving perhaps to the right and women to the left. That's backed up by lots of different surveys now. A new survey out later this week shows that that is actually getting more pronounced. The views of women and men in Australia are becoming more divided. Professor Nicholas Biddle has led this data collection and will be publishing it in a couple of days. He gave me a special look at it, which I've published today on the ABC website. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so this data looks at women and men and how they view different things. First of all, what does the data show about the views of men and women and how they differ?
Yeah, so we've got about 3,600 males and females in our sample. And what's, I guess, really interesting is both the change through time as well as what the different views are as we lead into the election. So one of the really interesting patterns is that, both males and females think that, things are getting better for men, things are getting better for women, but the views on one's own sex, one's own gender are kind of diverging a little bit. So men think things are getting better for women, women think things are getting better for men, kind of more so than the other way around.
Yeah, and that's obviously quite a big divide if you look at, society operating kind of functionally, if there is a sort of resentment between the genders. Yep. What does it predict about the way they may vote or how they're looking at the political parties, given, we have an election in 2 weeks?
Yeah, so there's a lot of data around about how kind of voting patterns might differ for males and females. And what's really interesting, at least over the last couple of months, we have had a little bit of a convergence. So the coalition was looking much stronger in terms of the male vote at the start of the year, and that's kind of dropped off a little bit. So a little bit of convergence in voting. But I guess what's really interesting is that kind of gender attitudes to gender issues are really strongly predictive of how people both view the party, view the leaders, and how they think they're going to vote. Almost to the extent that it kind of dominates the person's own agenda. So if you kind of ask someone, do they think that things have gone too far or not far enough? How important is gender equality? That's really strongly predictive of people's vote and dominates people's own kind of gender and how they vote themselves. Right. So there was also a really interesting increase in the number of people who thought gender equality had gone too far, a kind of doubling. Just talk me through that. Yeah, so we asked this in 2022, just prior to the last election, and we've asked it again. And what we've found for both males and females, an increase in the proportion of people who think that gender equality has gone too far, but certainly males are more likely to say that. And what's really interesting is the most common response for males is that it's about right, but you have almost exactly the same number of males saying that things have gone too far as saying that gender equality hasn't gone far enough. And that's quite different to what we found in the lead up to the previous election. Because just to remind people who, have got better things to do than think about all of the different trends, before the last election, there was a big backlash from women and gender was huge as an issue, particularly Scott Morrison and the way he'd handled some issues in the parliament. Had been a big issue, and some people attribute the teal wave, all of those independent women being elected, to those issues, right? Yeah, and what we've seen is some improvement in terms of how both males and females think about the coalition in terms of gender equality. So when we ask people about how they rate the different parties, it's still the Labor Party, for both males and females, which is more trusted with regards to gender equality. But the coalition has come off a little bit of its very low point in the last election. Okay, so there is an improvement.
A lot of kind of analysis was put into the gender divide in the American election. Yep. And I note that they're kind of messaging to different groups in this election. It's my own analysis that I think that, you know, when you hear Anthony Albanese, I feel like he's really pitching to women when he's talking about policies. In the debate on the ABC, when David Spears asked for them to nominate, you know, signature policies, he mentioned affordable childcare. Peter Dutton mentioned energy. It seems to be about these different groups and how they might be feeling. Is that your take on what we're seeing in terms of who they're speaking to?
Yeah, certainly we see in our data when we look at policy prioritisation, the areas which are most strongly prioritised by female voters, so action on domestic violence, childcare, aged care, they tend to also be a focus of the Labor Party's message, but also strongly associated with kind of a strong Labor Party vote. And then you find the opposite in terms of the policy priorities, which are relatively high for males, and one which I think is changed, not necessarily over the last couple of years, but over the longer term, is the national economy. So the national economy used to be something which had a higher prioritisation amongst female voters, but now that's the area which, relatively speaking, males see as their highest priority. So you can kind of see a way in which both the parties are targeting particular voters, but also where they're playing to their strengths. And I think that's going to be the real challenge for both parties is to not lose their traditional strengths, but also to chip away at the areas and the issues which the other party might be relatively favoured towards, and there is a gender aspect to that.
Peter Dutton, before the election properly started, did an interview, so did Anthony Albanese with Mark Bouris on his podcast, and it was Peter Dutton who mentioned this thing about how, you know, he was being asked to be clear, but about, you know, some men feeling like women are getting promotions over them. It got some headlines at the time. It hasn't been mentioned since. But these figures in your survey just made me think this is a view. It's not the majority view at all, but more men are feeling that way, that they're maybe even discriminated against in the workforce. Is that kind of a sentiment you picked up?
Yeah, so certainly a increased sentiment around those issues compared to the previous election. But I guess there's a real challenge for the opposition leader because any time in which if the opposition leader or the coalition makes gender a focus of the election, it's not playing to their strength. So there's a real balance for the opposition leader to, you know, tap into that that perception, which obviously he was doing in that interview, but also a recognition that if the focus of the election does become an increased focus on gender issues than it has up until now, then that's not going to play very well for the coalition. That's
really interesting. Well, on that issue, the opposition leader was asked about domestic violence today when he announced his crime policies. He said more was coming on that, which will be a bespoke policy probably later this week. So clearly they know that they need to articulate a clearer plan on some of these issues, which are vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah, and certainly, as you mentioned, childcare is another one which not only is an issue seen as very important for female voters, but also one which the opposition has struggled with. And I think in terms of domestic violence, it's certainly the case that the Labor Party is seen as having a, or at least in our data, there's a more favourable view towards the Labor Party around that issue. But it is one which aligns, I guess, with another issue which is relatively strong for the coalition, which is around crime and the criminal justice system more broadly. So it might be an issue which the coalition sees as being a little bit in its area of strength, and one which it's able to focus on, let alone the genuine fact, I think, that the opposition leader sees as a very important issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. They are certainly with voting starting tomorrow, focusing on areas where they think they have an advantage, that's for sure. Nicholas Biddle, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And just finally, in some news that's actually just broken while we've been on air this afternoon. The Australian Electoral Commission is now investigating an unauthorised pamphlet criticising independent MP for Wentworth, Allegra Spender, after it received complaints. Now, Allegra Spender has stood up and spoken to the media in the last hour. She says the pamphlet implies her campaign is anti-Semitic, an accusation she utterly rejects. She labelled the pamphlet a smear campaign, that it's clearly designed, she says, to ensure a Liberal MP is elected in Wentworth. So the Australian Electoral Commission is also looking at this. At the same time, you might have recalled last week, there's also an investigation by the police in this case, but into some banners that were shared in southeast Melbourne. That's in the seat of Bruce. That's the seat that the Liberal Party is campaigning very hard to try and win. The sitting MP in that particular electorate is a Labor MP, Julian Hill. He's an Assistant Minister as well for Multicultural Affairs. And there were some banners also put up in that electorate which were homophobic. They've been denounced. The police are investigating, where they were printed, what's gone on there. Obviously also not authorised. Allegra Spender, back in her case, a separate case to be clear, but has said that this is concerning. These are dirty tricks. Now, we often see in election campaigns they can become quite dirty, and there are avenues, the Electoral Commission, the police, for investigating these issues so that only material that's authorised, and of course homophobia or racism is unacceptable in these sorts of materials. Well, that's it for Afternoon Briefing for today. Just to remind you that we're on iView, we're streamed live on YouTube if you want to catch up. And we've had a really interesting program. Given it's Easter Monday, I know many of you are still on holidays or just ending the Easter weekend. And the politicians now, with voting starting tomorrow, that means early voting starts, and we know Australians love to early vote. They don't want to line up anymore on a Saturday like we used to. So it's been the final pitches before people go and vote tomorrow. So today, spoken to a couple of really interesting people. Malcolm Turnbull, of course, was the Prime Minister in Australia. He joined us a little earlier. And the Shadow Foreign Minister for the Liberals, David Coleman, also joined us. So did Tim Costello. We'll be back 4 o'clock tomorrow for another edition of Afternoon Briefing. I hope you have a lovely last day of your public holidays this afternoon. Joe O'Brien is up next with our top stories. I'll see you tomorrow.